Along the winding banks of the Nile River, where golden reeds sway gently and the soil darkens into rich, fertile bands, time itself seems to exhale. This is a place where history does not merely linger, it unfolds in layers, etched into stone, sung in hymns to the sun, and carried on the breath of desert winds. The Nile, the lifeblood of Egypt, has flowed with quiet persistence for millennia, nurturing a civilization so enduring, so radiant, that even in ruins it continues to fascinate the modern mind. To speak of ancient Egypt is to speak of a world that knew time differently, a world measured not only by the rise and fall of empires, but by the turning of the stars and the annual flood that returned the land to life. The river dictated the rhythms of agriculture and the cadence of worship. From the cataracts in the south to the marshy delta in the north, the Nile was the great unifier, carrying people, grain, and gods through the heart of a desert kingdom. Along its edges, cities and temples bloomed like lotuses, each a testimony to the belief that the divine walked among mortals in the form of kings. When most people imagine ancient Egypt, they see pyramids piercing the sky, staring into eternity from the edge of the sands. They see statues with inscrutable smiles, painted tombs, and golden treasures buried deep beneath the earth. These wonders are real, of course, but they are only fragments of a much deeper story. The true miracle of Egypt was not merely its monumental architecture, but the longevity of its civilization. More than 3,000 years of continuous cultural expression, spiritual refinement, and political reinvention. No other ancient world rivaled its sheer span of dynasties, deities, and discoveries. This is a land that gave birth to sacred kingship, where pharaohs were not simply rulers, but living gods, stewards of divine order, Mahat, in a cosmos forever threatened by chaos. It was a civilization of balance and dualities, life and death, Upper and Lower Egypt, sun and moon, desert and flood. Its pantheon was crowded with gods who took the form of animals, stars, and human hybrids, each carrying symbolism deeper than a single lifetime could fully grasp. Its burial practices, so elaborate and layered, were not obsessions with death, but fierce affirmations of eternal life. And yet, despite its mystical depth, Egypt was also pragmatic and curious. Its priests charted the stars and measured time with shadow and sand. Its builders moved stones weighing hundreds of tons with ingenuity that still stirs debate. Its scribes recorded transactions, hymns, dreams, and decrees with scripts so complex they would not be deciphered until centuries after the last temple fell silent. Its artisans, working in copper and gold, captured the delicacy of lotus blossoms and the eternal gaze of a pharaoh in repose. It is no exaggeration to call Egypt a cradle of civilization. While other great ancient cultures, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and China, flourished in parallel, Egypt's continuity and cohesion set it apart. Kingdoms rose and fell elsewhere, but Egypt endured, preserving its traditions through invasions, droughts, and dynastic changes. Even as it absorbed influences from Nubians, Libyans, Persians, Greeks, and Romans, it remained profoundly itself, a civilization so confident in its rhythms that time moved at its own pace. In this journey, we will follow the long arc of Egyptian history, beginning before the pyramids rose, when the Nile still whispered through tribal lands and the first kings claimed the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. We'll trace the golden centuries of the Old Kingdom, witness collapse and resurgence in the Middle Kingdom, and sail through the splendor of empire during the New Kingdom. We'll pause at moments of revolution and heresy, from Akhenaten's sun worship to the fleeting reign of the boy king Tutankhamun. We'll stand beneath the colossal statues of Ramses the Great, listen to the rustle of papyrus scrolls, and feel the silence of tombs sealed for millennia. But we'll also drift beyond the monuments, into the lives of the people. Farmers planting by the calendar of the stars, priests tending sacred fires, mothers telling their children tales of Osiris and the underworld, artisans mixing paints for the afterlife. These quieter stories, though less visible than temples and treasure, are the pulse of Egypt's soul. So let us begin where time began, not with conquests or calendars, but with water, light, and vision. Let us walk the banks of the Nile, not in haste, but gently, like the river itself. For in this place, history is not a series of dates. It is a rhythm, a breath, a flame carried forward by the hope that the soul, like the sun, rises again. Long before the pyramids graced the desert skyline and the names of pharaohs echoed through the halls of eternity, Egypt was a land of river and sky, of floodplain and sun-baked earth. Around 5000 BCE, the Nile was already shaping the destiny of the people who settled along its banks. The river, which surged and receded with dependable rhythm, turned an otherwise harsh and arid landscape into a haven of fertility and abundance. Life clung to its shores, and communities began to form in response to the blessings and demands of this great waterway. The earliest Egyptians were not builders of temples or scribes of epic texts. They were farmers, hunters, and artisans who learned to live with and honor the rhythms of the land. As the climate of the Sahara grew increasingly dry, small nomadic bands migrated toward the Nile Valley, where they found reliable water, wild game, and rich soils that responded generously to cultivation. Over time, these bands became villages, and villages grew into more complex settlements, giving rise to what we now call the pre-dynastic cultures of Egypt. In this formative period, agriculture took root. People learned to plant emmer wheat and barley, to tend herds of cattle and goats, and to store surplus grain in pottery jars. They developed early irrigation methods to harness the floodwaters of the Nile and direct them toward their fields. With agriculture came stability, and with stability came innovation. The people began crafting more refined tools, firing durable pottery, and engaging in long-distance trade with neighboring cultures, exchanging goods like ivory, obsidian, and incense. Pottery from this period reveals much about the evolution of early Egyptian culture. The vessels were not merely utilitarian, they bore decorative motifs. Animals, river scenes, geometric patterns that suggest a burgeoning aesthetic sense and perhaps even symbolic meaning. These were not just objects of storage, they were objects of expression, reflecting a growing awareness of the relationship between daily life and something greater, something sacred. Religious rites also began to emerge in this time, hinting at the spiritual sophistication that would later blossom into Egypt's elaborate pantheon. Graves from the Badarian and Naqada cultures show signs of deliberate burial practices, bodies positioned carefully, accompanied by pottery, jewelry, and offerings of food. Such care suggests a belief in some form of existence beyond death. Even in this early era, the Egyptians were peering into the mystery of the afterlife. a theme that would define their civilization for millennia to come. As these early societies flourished, Egypt gradually began to split, geographically and culturally, into two distinct regions. Upper Egypt in the south, where the Nile runs narrow and deep between limestone cliffs, and Lower Egypt in the north, where the river fans out into a broad delta. Each region developed its own customs, deities, and artistic styles. Upper Egypt was more rural and conservative, known for its hardy people and firm traditions, while Lower Egypt was more cosmopolitan, shaped by trade and contact with the Mediterranean world. This cultural duality would leave a deep imprint on the later mythos of the land. The ancient Egyptians would forever regard their country as a union of two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, symbolized by the double crown worn by pharaohs and the two goddesses who guarded their sovereignty. Long before political unification, a spiritual geography had already taken root. Even in the pre-dynastic era, signs of social stratification began to appear. Some graves were larger and more richly furnished than others, hinting at the rise of local elites, perhaps chieftains or proto-kings who commanded resources and loyalty. Hierarchical structures were taking shape, as was the idea that some individuals held special connection to the divine or natural order. Toward the end of the pre-dynastic period, this social and political organization became more defined. Small chiefdoms and proto-kingdoms emerged, often engaged in competition or alliance with one another. Among them was a powerful figure who would later be mythologized as Nama, or sometimes Menes, the first unifier of Egypt. His name and symbols appear on ancient ceremonial palettes, suggesting a victory that brought Upper and Lower Egypt under a single rule, marking the dawn of dynastic history. But before such unifications, before pyramids rose and temples echoed with hymns to Horus and Ra, there was simply the Nile and the people who listened to its rhythm. They planted, they worshipped, they built the first steps of civilization, not in stone, but in clay, in ritual, and in the quiet dignity of daily life. It was here, in this pre-dawn of history, that the spirit of Egypt began to stir. In the winding centuries leading up to Egypt's first dynastic rulers, a quieter revolution was taking shape, one not built in stone or bronze, but in the soft traces of ink and clay. As early settlements grew into complex societies, the Egyptians began to develop what we might call proto-writing, a system of symbols and marks that hinted at language without yet fully becoming it. This early communication system, dating back to around 3300 BCE, served as a bridge between memory and permanence, between oral tradition and the fixed word. These symbols were not used for casual correspondence or poetry, but rather for recording important matters, inventories of goods, ownership, religious dedications, and administrative tallies. Etched into pottery shards and carved on ivory tags, these marks reveal a society increasingly concerned with order, record, and authority. In many ways, proto-writing was a response to the growing complexity of social and economic life along the Nile. With more people, more goods, and more rules came the need to remember, formally and permanently. As this form of symbolic communication spread, it laid the foundations for what would later evolve into hieroglyphics, the sophisticated writing system that would come to define ancient Egypt. In time, writing would be woven into every fabric of Egyptian society, from temple walls to papyrus scrolls, from legal contracts to the sacred Book of the Dead. But here, in its earliest form, it served a humbler yet critical function, keeping the fragile threads of a growing society intact. Alongside the rise of written symbols came a visible deepening of social stratification. The once relatively egalitarian village life gave way to a structured hierarchy. Graves and artifacts from the Naqada II period, 3500 to 3200 BCE, show a widening gap between the lives of elites and commoners. The tombs of the wealthier classes grew larger and more elaborate, often stocked with imported goods and finely crafted jewelry. Certain individuals began to be buried with symbols of power, mace heads, pallets, and ceremonial weapons, suggesting a new political order was crystallizing. This hierarchy wasn't just about wealth, it was also about religious and symbolic authority. Chiefs became kings, and kings became more than men. The seeds of divine kingship, which would dominate Egypt's future, were being sown in the quiet soil of the pre-dynastic Nile. And then came a legend, a name that would echo across the millennia as the first great unifier of Egypt, Narmer. The story of Narmer is part history, part myth, and entirely foundational. He is believed to have ruled around 3100 BCE, and according to tradition, he was the one who unified Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom. Whether this unification happened suddenly, through conquest, or gradually through alliances and shared culture, remains debated. What we do know comes primarily from a single astonishing artifact, the Narmer pallet. This ceremonial siltstone slab, discovered at Hierakonpolis, offers a vivid snapshot of Egypt's earliest royal ideology. On one side, Narmer is depicted wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, on the other, the red crown of Lower Egypt, an image of dual sovereignty that would become a standard symbol for pharaonic rule. He is shown smiting an enemy, leading processions, and standing larger than other figures, establishing both his might and his divinity. While much of the pallet's imagery is symbolic rather than literal, it nonetheless marks a seismic shift, the idea that one person could embody both political power and cosmic balance. Narmer or his successors likely established the first centralized rule from Memphis, strategically located between Upper and Lower Egypt. From this point forward, Egypt would consider itself the two lands, a kingdom united in diversity, watched over by a singular divine king. The memory of Narmer's unification would resonate through every dynasty that followed. Pharaohs would invoke his legacy as the original bringer of order to chaos, the divine heir to the land's dual spirit. The double crown he wore would become the visual shorthand for authority, and his palette would become an icon of Egypt's first breath as a civilization. This chapter, then, ends not with an empire, but with its blueprint. The Nile had nurtured farmers, artists, priests, and warriors. Now it had nurtured a kingdom. Proto-writing had given birth to record-keeping. Local chiefs had become sacred kings, and scattered villages had merged into the stirrings of a unified state. Egypt stood at the threshold of greatness, ready to rise, eternal and golden, into the pages of history. With the dawn of Dynasty III, around 2686 BCE, ancient Egypt entered an era that would earn its timeless nickname, the Old Kingdom. It was a time when architecture soared to the heavens, kings were deified in stone, and the idea of eternity became not only a spiritual aspiration, but also a political blueprint. Known later by scholars as the Age of the Pyramids, This period witnessed the formation of a centralized state, the expansion of bureaucracy, and a religious ideology that bound heaven to earth through ritual, construction, and cosmic order. At the heart of this transformation stood King Djoser, the first ruler of the Third Dynasty. His reign marked a dramatic shift in how kingship expressed itself, not just through words or rituals, but through the medium of monumental stone architecture. Before Djoser, tombs were modest structures made of mud brick, known as mastabas. These flat-roofed buildings sat low against the desert, discreetly sheltering the dead. But Djoser, advised by a brilliant mind at his court, would change everything. That mind belonged to Imhotep, a name that would echo through history not only as a royal advisor and high priest of the sun god Ra, but as the first architect and engineer recorded by name in human history. A polymath long before the word existed, Imhotep designed what would become Egypt's first pyramid, not the smooth-sided forms that would later define Giza, but a bold experiment in elevation, the step pyramid at Saqqara. Rising in 6 distinct layers, the step pyramid stood over 60 meters high, a breathtaking leap from any earlier structure built in the ancient world. It was not merely a tomb, but a cosmic ladder designed to help Djoser's spirit ascend to the heavens and join the gods in the afterlife. Beneath it, a vast complex of courtyards, shrines, and ceremonial halls stretched across stone-paved ground, forming Egypt's first truly monumental funerary complex. Everything about Saqqara was planned with symmetry and symbolism in mind, as if the stone itself were a hymn to eternity. Imhotep's genius did not go unnoticed by future generations. Centuries later, he would be deified as a god of wisdom and healing, worshipped not only in Egypt, but eventually adopted into the Greek pantheon as a figure comparable to Asclepius. Yet during his lifetime, his works were built in service of the king, a divine ruler whose tomb was meant to endure for eternity. And it did. Over 4 millennia later, Djoser's step pyramid still stands, battered but proud, a monument not only to one man's ambition, but to the very birth of architecture as a sacred craft. The innovations of Djoser and Imhotep set the tone for the dynasties that followed. Pharaohs saw themselves not only as mortal rulers, but as living gods, entrusted with maintaining Ma'at, the divine order of the universe. To do so required more than law and ritual. It demanded permanence, and permanence was carved in stone. What began at Saqqara would soon evolve into the smooth-sided marvels of Giza, but the first step, literally and figuratively, belonged to Djoser. Beyond the pyramids, the Old Kingdom also witnessed the strengthening of Egypt's centralized government. Royal officials and scribes became indispensable to managing the growing complexity of state affairs. They documented harvests, organized labor, and ensured that tribute from the provinces flowed steadily into the royal granaries and treasuries. This burgeoning bureaucracy was both a blessing and a burden. It gave the pharaoh unmatched control over resources, but also created a powerful class of administrators who would later prove difficult to manage. Still, for the time being, the king remained unchallenged, and his image multiplied endlessly in statues, reliefs, and inscriptions. Across the Nile Valley, quarrymen carved limestone blocks under the heat of the sun, while artisans decorated tomb walls with scenes of daily life, agriculture, and ritual. These were not merely images. They were prayers in stone, magical blueprints for the afterlife intended to serve the deceased in their eternal existence. Thus, the Old Kingdom was a time of faith. Faith in kingship, faith in ritual, and faith in architecture's ability to bridge the human and divine. In the quiet deserts where the pyramids rose, eternity was not a far-off idea. It was a place being built, one stone at a time. After Djoser's daring ascent at Saqqara, the Old Kingdom entered its most dazzling phase, a period when stone took on a near-celestial ambition under the Fourth Dynasty. South of modern-day Cairo, on a plateau that rises gently above the floodplain, three colossal monuments emerged: the Great Pyramids of Giza. Built for the pharaohs Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure between roughly 2580 and 2510 BCE, these smooth-sided pyramids distilled every architectural lesson learned at Saqqara into structures of breathtaking scale and precision. Khufu's pyramid alone rose some 146 meters high, once the tallest human-made structure on Earth, its limestone casing stones gleaming in the desert sun like a staircase for the soul of a king. Adjacent to Khafre's pyramid sits the enigmatic Great Sphinx, a monumental guardian carved from a single outcrop of limestone. With a lion's body and a human head, most scholars believe it carries Khafre's features. The Sphinx gazes eternally eastward, toward the dawn and the life-giving rays of the sun. It is both sentinel and sermon, proclaiming that earthly power and cosmic order are inseparable. Where the pyramids proclaim ascent, the Sphinx proclaims vigilance. The pharaoh, even in death, watches over the land he ruled, embodying the harmony between humankind and the divine order of nature. These monuments were far more than royal tombs. They were theology in stone. During the Fourth Dynasty, Egyptian religion crystallized around Ra, the sun god, whose daily journey across the sky became the central metaphor for life, death, and rebirth. Pharaohs claimed to be the sons of Ra, their reigns manifestations of the sun's cyclical triumph over darkness. The pyramid's triangular form, its apex pointing to the zenith, symbolized the slanted rays of the sun breaking through clouds, guiding the king's spirit heavenward. In temple reliefs and pyramid texts, we see the pharaoh merging with Ra, sailing across the sky in a solar bark, reborn each dawn with the rising sun. This theological refinement went hand in hand with political consolidation. Under Khufu and his successors, a centralized government reached levels of organization unprecedented in the ancient world. Provincial governors, called nomarchs, administered the nomes, districts, while a sophisticated corps of scribes recorded everything from crop yields to labor rotations. Vast teams of quarrymen, engineers, and skilled laborers were mustered for state projects. Contrary to popular myth, the pyramid builders were not enslaved multitudes driven by whips. Evidence suggests they were seasonal laborers. Farmers during the inundation months, when fields lay underwater, supported by royal granaries and motivated by religious devotion and civic pride. Yet the very mechanisms that enabled such grandeur contained seeds of strain. As the pyramids grew larger, so too did the demands on the treasury and the logistical burden on the workforce. Royal largesse flowed into priesthoods managing the funerary cults of deceased kings. Endowments of land and labor were granted to sustain rituals in perpetuity. Over generations, these tax-exempt estates accumulated wealth and autonomy, slowly diluting the pharaoh's absolute economic control. By the time of the 5th and 6th dynasties, the focus of royal building shifted from megalithic pyramids to smaller tombs, accompanied by elaborate sun temples, reflecting both a deepening solar theology and the realities of limited resources. Meanwhile, regional nomarchs, often hereditary in their offices, became power centers unto themselves. Inscriptions from provincial tombs begin to boast of local achievements and independent wealth, while the grandeur of royal pyramids diminished in size and craftsmanship. Administrative records hint at increasingly frequent Nile failures during the late 6th dynasty, leading to poor harvests and famine. As resources grew scarce, the once unquestioned authority of the pharaoh faltered. Workers' rations went unpaid. Local leaders filled the void, providing for their communities and earning loyalty beyond the throne's reach. The central bureaucracy, stretched thin by grand construction and challenged by natural hardship, began to crack. The last ruler of the Old Kingdom, Pepi II, is said to have reigned for more than 90 years. Such longevity, once a symbol of divine favor, became a governance hazard. As Pepi aged, court factions vied for influence, and succession became uncertain. Upon his death, the over-centralized machine he had inherited no longer had the momentum or resources to keep provincial ambitions in check. The royal court at Memphis dimmed, and the bright, ordered world of the pyramid builders slipped into shadows of regional rivalries. Thus, the Old Kingdom closes on a wistful note, supreme confidence rendered fragile by its own scale. Yet its monuments endure, shimmering in moonlight above the desert. In them, we still hear the Old Kingdom's serene conviction. That stone, aligned with the sun and the stars, could outlast chaos and preserve the soul's journey forever. They remain hymns in limestone to a moment when humanity dared to translate eternity into architecture, binding heaven and earth with blocks of quarried light. As the monumental age of pyramid building faded into history, Egypt entered a time of deep uncertainty, a chapter known today as the First Intermediate Period, stretching roughly from 2181 to 2055 BCE. This was not a clean break, but a slow unraveling. What had once been a unified kingdom under the firm hand of the pharaoh began to fragment, revealing the limits of central power and the fragility of even the most well-organized civilizations. At the heart of the decline was a growing disconnect between the royal court at Memphis and the provincial regions, especially in Upper Egypt. For centuries, Egypt's centralized bureaucracy had managed the distribution of grain, coordinated large labor forces, and maintained infrastructure along the Nile. But as successive kings of the late 6th dynasty built smaller, less impressive pyramids and granted ever more power and land to regional elites, particularly the nomarchs or provincial governors, the balance of authority began to shift away from the center. These nomarchs, originally appointed by the king, began to act more autonomously, building their own tombs, amassing local wealth, and passing their offices down hereditarily. Where once all power radiated from the pharaoh as the divine embodiment of Ma'at, the cosmic principle of order, now rival power centers emerged in the nomes, each claiming legitimacy in its own right. Local loyalty began to outweigh allegiance to the crown. Worse still, environmental pressures compounded the political fragmentation. Egypt's prosperity had always hinged on the rhythms of the Nile. Its annual flooding provided the irrigation necessary to sustain agriculture and support the population. But during the latter part of the Old Kingdom and into the First Intermediate period, a series of low Nile floods caused widespread crop failures. Some modern scholars suspect broader climatic changes may have played a role, reducing rainfall in the Ethiopian highlands and limiting the flow of the river. The resulting famines were catastrophic. Grain prices soared, hunger spread, and the infrastructure that once redistributed food from surplus regions to those in need could no longer function effectively. With the collapse of state granaries and the breakdown of supply routes, many communities were left to fend for themselves. Local strongmen, warlords, and self-proclaimed rulers rose to fill the void, offering protection in exchange for loyalty. This growing fragmentation gave rise to internal conflict as rival factions vied for control of Egypt's heartland. Power vacuums invited competition. Noble families in different regions began erecting their own temples and commissioning scribes to record their deeds, often echoing the once exclusive epithets of kings. In time, these competing centers of power solidified into two major spheres, one in Heracleopolis, in Middle Egypt, and another in Thebes, in Upper Egypt. The rulers of Heracleopolis, descendants of a branch of the royal line, claimed to be the legitimate successors of the Old Kingdom, maintaining nominal control over the central Nile Valley. Meanwhile, in the southern city of Thebes, a powerful family rose to prominence, asserting their own claim to kingship and resisting Heracleopolitan control. Egypt, once a unified state, was now a land divided in two, with both sides claiming the right to rule. This was not simply a political conflict, it was also a spiritual and cultural reckoning. For centuries, Egyptian religion and society had revolved around the central figure of the pharaoh, whose connection to the gods ensured order and prosperity. With that link weakened, the very meaning of kingship was called into question. If the pharaoh could no longer prevent famine or disorder, was he still divine? The uncertainty of the age is reflected in its literature and art, which take on more somber and introspective tones. Texts like the admonitions of Ippur lament the collapse of order. The river is blood, and one drinks from it. Men shrink from human beings and thirst after water. Tomb inscriptions from regional leaders speak more openly of personal struggle and survival, emphasizing local heroism rather than cosmic harmony. Even burial practices changed, with modest regional tombs replacing the grand funerary complexes of the Old Kingdom. And yet, amid the collapse, there was also resilience. The disintegration of centralized power allowed for greater regional expression. Local artisans began experimenting with new artistic styles. Poets and scribes documented everyday life with newfound intimacy. In some ways, this period laid the groundwork for a more flexible and adaptive Egypt that would later rise in renewed form. But for now, Egypt was in the grip of chaos and famine, its people scattered between loyalties, its land caught between kings, and its future uncertain. The once eternal order of the Nile had been interrupted, and the land of pyramids stood at a crossroads, waiting for a unifier to restore what had been lost. As the Old Kingdom dissolved into memory, Egypt's once unified identity fractured under the strain of environmental hardship, social upheaval, and political disarray. The Nile still flowed, but its sacred role as the spine of a great and orderly kingdom had been compromised. In its place rose a new Egypt, one that was no longer guided by a singular divine authority, but rather fractured into competing centers of power, most notably the dynasties of Heracleopolis and Thebes. In the north, the city of Heracleopolis Magna, modern Ichnazia, became the seat of what we now call the 9th and 10th dynasties. These rulers, descended from provincial governors, claimed to inherit the mantle of Old Kingdom pharaohs. They retained the trappings of centralized rule, maintaining connections with former capital centers like Memphis and overseeing administration in the fertile Middle Nile. However, their control was far from absolute. While they called themselves kings, their rule rested on shifting alliances with local elites and their own ability to project power across contested territories. To the south, a more vigorous power began to stir in Thebes, known in ancient times as Wasit. There, a family of local rulers, later formalized as the 11th dynasty, gained influence through both military initiative and spiritual legitimacy. Their main deity was Amun, a local god of Thebes who would later rise to national prominence. Unlike the northern kings, who often seemed content to manage what remained of the past, the Theban rulers demonstrated a determination to restore Egypt's glory. This division, north versus south, set the stage for a prolonged struggle over Egypt's future. What followed was a drawn-out conflict between the Heracleopolitan and Theban dynasties, one that spanned several generations. The Heracleopolitan kings attempted to expand southward, asserting control over crucial trade routes and Nile access points. In response, Theban rulers like Intef I and Intef II gradually pushed north, building alliances with other southern nomes and gaining prestige through military success. Each dynasty sought to outshine the other, not only on the battlefield, but also through religious patronage, architecture, and public works, all designed to project their claim to legitimacy. Amid this climate of rivalry and civil war, Egypt experienced one of its most creative literary and artistic phases, a paradoxical flowering during a time of disorder. It was in this age of uncertainty that the Egyptian soul seemed to look inward. The literature of the first intermediate period is marked by introspection, lamentation, and the grappling with what it means to live in a world without clear order. One of the most famous works from this period is The Dialogue of a Man with His Ba, a philosophical text in which a man debates with his soul, B.A., over the value of life and the lure of death. It is filled with existential questioning, revealing a shift from traditional hymns of stability to meditations on personal suffering and disillusionment. Another powerful piece is the Admonitions of Ipuwer, a poetic lament filled with striking imagery. The land is utterly perished. He who could not make sandals for himself is now a possessor of treasures. These works reflect not only the collapse of political structures, but also the crisis of faith in the old world order. The divine kingship of the Old Kingdom had promised balance and prosperity through Ma'at, the sacred harmony between nature, society, and the gods. Now that balance had been disrupted, and Egyptians turned to literature as a means to process and respond to this loss. In a way, this literary tradition represented Egypt's first existential reckoning. Art, too, evolved during this time, reflecting the regional fragmentation of the state. No longer bound by a strict Memphis-centered canon, artists in various nomes began to develop distinctive local styles. tombs in provincial areas featured more personal and intimate scenes of daily life, such as farming, fishing, and family gatherings, suggesting a greater focus on the individual and the earthly realm, rather than the strictly divine. Statues from this era are often more expressive, with less idealized features and more variation in form. While earlier sculpture had sought to immortalize the eternal image of the pharaoh, these works seem to capture real people, local lords, scribes, and families, all seeking some kind of permanence in a world that felt increasingly impermanent. And yet, despite the chaos, there remained a thread of continuity. The Nile still carried its waters north, planting cycles continued, and the people of Egypt endured. From this fractured landscape would soon rise a renewed vision of kingship, one forged not from inherited divinity, but from hard-won unification and a reimagined purpose. The seeds of the Middle Kingdom had already been sown in the fields of Thebes, awaiting the ruler who would mend the two lands and return Egypt to a golden age of order. The unification of Egypt under Mentuhotep II around 2055 BCE marked the beginning of one of the most refined and stable eras in Egyptian history, the Middle Kingdom. After more than a century of division and instability, the re-emergence of a centralized authority restored not only political balance, but also cultural and intellectual vitality. From Thebes, Mentuhotep II led a series of campaigns that brought the warring factions of Upper and Lower Egypt back under a single rule. This reunification wasn't merely territorial. It represented a reawakening of national identity, faith in the divine pharaoh, and confidence in the future. The Nile, once lined with competing rulers and rival gods, now flowed steadily under the banner of a renewed state. This era was not one of grand pyramids or colossal military conquests, but of refinement, restoration, and meaningful advancement. It saw a flourishing of art and literature that delved deeper into human emotion, ethical reflection, and civic duty. The stories and teachings recorded during this period suggest a more introspective and morally grounded society than before. Among these were wisdom texts and moral tales, such as The Tale of the Eloquent Peasant, which pleaded for justice in a time when justice had grown precious again. These writings didn't only praise pharaohs, they pondered life's hardships and the responsibilities of rulers and common people alike. They were crafted by scribes in elegant Middle Egyptian, a literary form that would remain a standard for centuries. Irrigation and land management saw notable improvements as well. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom understood that prosperity depended on their ability to tame the floodwaters of the Nile. Projects to repair and extend canals, control water flow, and restore arable land were given great importance. These hydraulic efforts ensured more reliable harvests, especially in areas previously made vulnerable during the disunity of the First Intermediate Period. The Fayum region, in particular, benefited from such development. Its lakes and marshes were gradually transformed into rich farmland through ambitious state-led projects. Fortification walls and granaries were erected not just to secure borders, but to build resilience against future disruptions. Monarchs such as Senusret I and Amenemhat I continued the work of consolidation, extending Egypt's presence deeper into Nubia and along trade routes into the Levant. They established fortresses along the southern border near the Second Cataract, not merely for military might, but also to protect the flow of goods and maintain diplomatic presence. These rulers balanced their expansion with an intense focus on internal affairs, elevating the role of provincial officials while ensuring their loyalty and investing in public works that emphasized stability over grandeur. Temples built during the Middle Kingdom took on new architectural clarity and religious focus, often harmonizing with local traditions. Amun, the Theban god, began to rise in prominence during this time. While not yet the all-dominant deity he would become in the New Kingdom, Amun's increasing stature signaled the growing influence of Thebes as both a political and spiritual capital. His temples began to appear in stone where once only mud brick sanctuaries stood, reflecting the renewed devotion of the people and their rulers. What truly defines the Middle Kingdom is the tone of calm sophistication that pervades its legacy. The pharaoh was once again revered as a divine figure, but no longer portrayed as an untouchable god-king removed from his people. In reliefs and literature, kings were depicted as shepherds, caretakers of the land and its people, rather than as distant titans. This subtle shift spoke volumes about how Egyptians saw themselves and their place in the universe after generations of upheaval. The Middle Kingdom did not roar with the triumphant conquests of empires, nor did it rise with monuments meant to touch the sky. Instead, it moved like the Nile, steady, measured, and essential. It brought Egypt back to itself, smoothing the cracks of history with a gentle but firm hand. In its irrigation channels and its moral parables, in the carved names of provincial governors, and the careful placement of temples, it whispered a promise that order could return, and that from order beauty might flourish once again. As the Middle Kingdom matured, so too did its religious and cultural landscape, most notably with the rising prominence of the god Amun. Centered in Thebes, now the spiritual and political heart of Egypt, Amun began to eclipse older deities, especially as his cult merged with that of Ra, the great sun god of Heliopolis. This fusion, Amun-Ra, would eventually become the supreme deity of the Egyptian pantheon, worshipped not only by the elite but by people from all walks of life. Temples dedicated to Amun were enlarged and richly decorated. Among them, the modest beginnings of the Karnak temple complex took root, slowly growing into one of the most magnificent sacred spaces in Egyptian history. The rise of Amun was more than theological. It was symbolic of Thebes' emergence as the new axis of power and stability in the Nile Valley. This spiritual transformation went hand in hand with innovations in burial practices. Whereas earlier periods had largely reserved elaborate mortuary architecture and rites for royalty, the Middle Kingdom witnessed the democratization of the afterlife. Tombs of officials and middle-ranking members of society began to reflect a similar care and artistry once reserved for kings. Coffins were inscribed with coffin texts, spells and instructions adapted from the royal pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom, allowing more Egyptians to navigate the afterlife's perils. These texts emphasized moral conduct and personal piety, suggesting that divine favor could be earned through just behavior, not merely inherited status. Burial sites also expanded beyond royal necropolises. Middle-class Egyptians were now often interred with goods, amulets, and figurines to assist them beyond death. Tomb decoration reached new emotional and artistic heights during this period. Scenes of daily life, harvesting grain, fishing in the Nile, banqueting with family, were rendered in vivid color and motion, offering not only a hopeful image of the afterlife, but a celebration of the life just lived. These murals didn't merely serve symbolic function, they provide historians today with rare insight into the culture, labor, and leisure of non-royal Egyptians. The emphasis on commoners in funerary art suggests a shift in worldview. Pharaohs remained central, but the experiences of farmers, craftsmen, and scribes were now recognized as threads in the divine tapestry of Egypt. Alongside spiritual development came geographic expansion. The Middle Kingdom saw Egypt extend its reach decisively into Nubia, a region to the south, rich in gold, cattle, ivory, and other resources vital to Egypt's economy. Unlike earlier, more tentative interactions, the Middle Kingdom's campaigns were sustained and strategic. Fortresses such as Buhan and Semna were constructed along the Nile's southern stretches, not only to protect trade routes, but to assert military presence. These installations were equipped with storerooms, garrisons, and administrative offices, testament to the organized and enduring nature of Egyptian interests in the region. More than simple occupation, this was integration. Egyptians settled in Nubian lands, and Nubian influences gradually seeped into Egyptian art, iconography, and even the army. Trade also flourished under this expansion. Expeditions ventured to the Red Sea coast and into the eastern desert in search of exotic goods and sacred materials. The famed story of Sinuhe, one of Egypt's greatest literary works, likely written during this time, refers to the interconnectedness of neighboring cultures and the far reach of Egypt's prestige. In the tale, a royal official flees to Asia but later returns to Egypt, yearning for his homeland and a proper burial. It is a story soaked in longing, loyalty, and the belief in Egyptian order as a cosmic necessity. Perhaps the most distinctive feature of the Middle Kingdom, however, was its attention to the everyday Egyptian. Statues, inscriptions, and papyri from this period highlight not just royal deeds, but the wisdom of scribes, the toil of builders, and the prayers of farmers. Pharaohs such as Senusret III were depicted with solemn, almost weary faces, an artistic choice that suggested not only humanity, but burden. These were no longer eternal gods above reproach. They were stewards of order, laboring under the weight of maintaining Ma'at, the eternal balance. In these reflections of daily life and duty, the Middle Kingdom emerges not as a flamboyant renaissance, but as a quiet, deliberate reclamation of greatness. It balanced power with empathy, expansion with introspection, and spirituality with practicality. Egypt's soul was not only restored, but deepened, and in this soft maturity, the Nile carried its people once again toward a future etched in stone and spirit. As the Middle Kingdom slowly declined, a new era of upheaval emerged, one shaped not solely by internal strife, but by the arrival of foreign rulers. These were the Hyksos, a mysterious group of Asiatic peoples who swept into the Nile Delta and ushered in the Second Intermediate Period, a time marked by fragmentation, transformation, and the seeds of a military renaissance. The Hyksos, whose name was later interpreted by Egyptians as rulers of foreign lands, likely originated from regions to the northeast of Egypt, perhaps from Canaan or Syria. They were not a single invading army, but rather a gradual influx of Semitic-speaking peoples who integrated into Egyptian society over time, especially during the waning years of the Middle Kingdom. As Egypt's central authority weakened, these immigrants, already living and trading in the delta, took advantage of political disunity to establish their own power bases. By around 1650 BCE, the Hyksos had seized control of northern Egypt, establishing their capital at Avaris in the eastern delta. From there, they ruled over Lower Egypt, while Upper Egypt remained under native Egyptian dynasties centered in Thebes. This division marked a new and unsettling duality within the land of the Nile. For the first time in its long history, Egypt was being ruled not only by outsiders, but by rulers who were visibly different in language, custom, and style. And yet, the Hyksos did not arrive as mere destroyers. In many ways, they were assimilators, adopting and adapting the grandeur of Egyptian court life, religion, and art. They styled themselves as pharaohs, wore traditional Egyptian regalia, and even paid homage to Egyptian gods. Temples were built in Egyptian fashion, and administrative practices were largely retained. However, their foreign origin was never fully forgotten by the native Egyptians, especially those in the south, who viewed Hyksos rule as both an affront and a challenge to Egyptian sovereignty. The most profound impact of the Hyksos was technological. They introduced innovations that would forever change the Egyptian military, most notably the horse-drawn chariot, a revolutionary instrument of speed and mobility. Along with the chariot came new types of bows, improved bronze weaponry, and battle strategies that would be honed by the Egyptians in future generations. What initially gave the Hyksos their edge would, in time, become Egypt's own strength, refined and redeployed during its resurgence. Culturally, the Hyksos also brought influences from the wider Near Eastern world. Artifacts from Avaris show connections with Mesopotamian motifs, Syrian cylinder seals, and Levantine pottery styles. The blend of cultures at Avaris represents an early cosmopolitanism, one that challenged the insularity of Egyptian tradition and paved the way for a broader worldview in the centuries to come. However, for many Egyptians, this period was remembered less for its cultural diversity and more for the indignity of foreign domination. Religious synthesis also occurred. The Hyksos adopted Egyptian deities such as Seth, the god of chaos and storms, perhaps identifying him with their own storm gods like Baal. Seth's elevation during this period would later contribute to his complex role in Egyptian mythology, both revered and reviled. While the Hyksos honored Egyptian traditions outwardly, their reign remained, to native scribes and historians, a blemish, a foreign presence in a land long proud of its divine and dynastic continuity. The coexistence between Hyksos rulers in the north and Egyptian dynasties in the south was tense but, for a time, stable. Trade continued along the Nile, and there is little evidence of constant warfare during the early years of Hyksos rule. Still, the cultural memory of foreign dominance lingered like a shadow over the Egyptian heartland. Eventually, resistance would rise. Not immediately, but slowly, as native rulers in Thebes grew bolder and more organized. In hindsight, the Hyksos were both a disruption and a catalyst. They fractured Egypt's unity, yes, but they also unwittingly ignited a military and political transformation. Their presence in the delta would awaken in Thebes a desire not merely to resist, but to reclaim and reforge Egypt's destiny. The tools the Hyksos introduced, chariots, composite bows, fortified settlements, would become the very instruments of their defeat in the next chapter of Egypt's story. Thus, The Second Intermediate Period was not a time of utter collapse, but of transition, a time when Egypt, fragmented and bruised, began to absorb the lessons of its conquerors. From this uneasy fusion of foreign and native would emerge a new age of pharaohs, warriors, and empire, the radiant dawn of the new kingdom. As the Hyksos solidified their hold over northern Egypt, establishing their capital at Avaris and ruling over the delta with foreign customs layered atop Egyptian tradition, the south remained unconquered. Here, in the sacred city of Thebes, native Egyptian dynasties endured, diminished in power but unbroken in will. It was in Thebes that a slow but determined resistance began to take shape, one that would eventually sweep away the foreign rulers and restore Egypt to native hands. The Theban kings, ruling from Upper Egypt, were not yet powerful enough to challenge the Hyksos directly during the early stages of their resistance. But they maintained a fierce sense of cultural and divine legitimacy, tracing their lineage back to the older pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom. They viewed themselves not as regional warlords, but as the rightful inheritors of Egyptian kingship. This belief, coupled with mounting resentment toward foreign domination, ignited a generation-spanning struggle that would ultimately define the twilight of the Second Intermediate Period. The earliest sparks of resistance came under the rule of Seqenenre Tao, a Theban king whose name is forever linked to the first open defiance of Hyksos control. Though the full details are lost to time, legends suggest that Seqenenre received insulting messages from the Hyksos king Apepi, perhaps mocking traditional religious practices such as the worship of sacred hippos that supposedly disturbed the peace of the Delta ruler. Whether provoked by insult or long-standing defiance, Seqenenre took up arms. His death in battle, or possibly in a violent encounter with Hyksos soldiers, is memorialized by his mummified remains, which bear deep head wounds that suggest a brutal end. His death, however, was not in vain. It became a rallying point for his successors. After Seqenenre's death, his son Kamose continued the fight. Kamose launched military campaigns northward, pushing into Hyksos-held territories with renewed vigor. In stelae inscribed during his reign, Kamose declared his disgust at the presence of a vile Asiatic ruler in the delta and lamented that Egypt had been sliced in two. His rhetoric and military action showed a bold departure from the cautious diplomacy of previous generations. Though Kamose's reign was short, he advanced the Theban frontier closer to the delta, weakening Hyksos control and paving the way for a final confrontation. The culmination of this multi-generational struggle came with Ahmose-Thum, the younger brother or possibly the son of Kamose. Ahmose, ascending to the Theban throne as a young man around 1550 BCE, inherited a kingdom hardened by war and fueled by the dream of reunification. Trained in warfare and commanding a loyal army, Ahmose launched the decisive campaigns that would finally drive the Hyksos from Egyptian soil. Ahmose's strategy combined military might with technological adaptation. He had learned from the enemy, employing chariots, advanced bronze weapons, and siege tactics, skills first introduced by the Hyksos themselves. His forces marched north, systematically attacking Hyksos fortresses, culminating in a prolonged siege of Avaris. This battle, likely brutal and protracted, marked the turning point. The Hyksos, no longer able to hold their stronghold, fled. Ahmose pursued them into southern Canaan, ensuring they would never return. With the defeat of the Hyksos and the capture of Avaris, Ahmose I became the liberator of Egypt. But he did not stop at victory. He continued his campaigns into Nubia and Canaan, not merely defending Egypt's borders, but expanding them. In doing so, he laid the foundation for what would become the New Kingdom, Egypt's most powerful and expansive era. Ahmose also understood the importance of internal consolidation. After the war, he re-established central authority, reopened trade routes, and embarked on monumental building projects. Temples were restored and new ones constructed, particularly in honor of Amun, the Theban god, whose rise to prominence mirrored Thebes' ascent. The symbolic connection between divine order and political unity was emphasized in art, literature, and architecture, reinforcing the idea that Ahmose's rule had restored Ma'at, cosmic balance, and justice. The memory of Hyksos rule did not fade easily. For centuries, Egyptian records depicted them as invaders and usurpers, cast in their reign as an aberration in the divine order of kingship. And yet, paradoxically, it was through the crucible of Hyksos domination that Egypt emerged stronger, more militarily sophisticated, and ready to assert itself as a dominant force in the ancient world. Thus, with the rise of Ahmose I and the expulsion of the Hyksos, the curtain closed on the Second Intermediate Period. Egypt was once again whole, its spirit unbroken, its ambitions reignited. And from the southern capital of Thebes, a new era of empire, glory, and grandeur was ready to unfold, carried forward on the winds of war and the memory of resistance. With the triumphant rise of Ahmose I and the decisive expulsion of the Hyksos from the Nile Delta, Egypt embarked on one of its most dynamic and glorious periods, known as the New Kingdom. Spanning from approximately 1550 to 1077 BCE, this era represented a renaissance of political power, military might, architectural ambition, and cross-cultural diplomacy. It was during this time that Egypt, once a land of scattered power centers and foreign occupation, transformed into an empire that would project its influence far beyond the Nile's familiar banks. Ahmose I laid the foundation of this rebirth with calculated precision. After vanquishing the Hyksos, he not only reclaimed Lower Egypt, but initiated a southern campaign into Nubia, ensuring control of the gold-rich region and reasserting Egyptian dominance over its traditional southern neighbor. These campaigns were not merely punitive, but strategic. Nubian wealth would help fund the temples and armies of the burgeoning empire. Ahmose also directed efforts to rebuild temples and restore the administrative systems that had faltered during the Second Intermediate Period. Temples to Amun, now the rising supreme deity of the Egyptian pantheon, began to dominate the skyline of Thebes. Following Ahmose's reign, a succession of rulers, including Amenhotep I and Thutmose I, continued to expand and solidify the gains of the early New Kingdom. Egypt's pharaohs were no longer just divine stewards of the land. They were generals, builders, and diplomats with international reach. The borders of Egypt expanded dramatically during this time. Campaigns into Canaan and Syria established Egyptian garrisons deep into the Levant, while repeated expeditions into Nubia ensured steady access to gold, ebony, and other luxuries that enriched the royal court. One of the most consequential of these early rulers was Thutmose III, sometimes referred to by modern historians as Egypt's Napoleon for his extraordinary military acumen. His reign, beginning as a co-regency with his powerful stepmother Hatshepsut and eventually transitioning into full pharaonic control, marked a period of unprecedented military campaigns. Thutmose III led at least 17 known expeditions into the Near East, defeating Canaanite coalitions and securing vital trade routes along the coast of the Mediterranean. His most famous victory came at the Battle of Megiddo, where, after a daring march through a narrow mountain pass, he surprised and defeated a formidable alliance of Syrian and Canaanite rulers. The victory at Megiddo not only demonstrated his bold tactical brilliance, but also served as a warning to all who might consider defying Egyptian power. These military victories extended Egypt's reach and ensured tribute from neighboring states, but just as importantly, they fostered an age of vibrant international diplomacy. Far from being mere conquerors, the New Kingdom pharaohs also became respected players on the international stage. Letters from the Amarna archives, discovered centuries later in the ruins of Akhetaten, reveal a complex web of alliances, marriages, and negotiations among the great powers of the time: Babylon, Mitanni, the Hittites, and Egypt. These brother kings exchanged gifts, wives, and diplomatic envoys, recognizing Egypt's stature as a leading force in the ancient world. Culturally, this period witnessed enormous investment in construction, with colossal temples rising across Egypt's cities. The city of Thebes blossomed into a spiritual and administrative center, and the temple complex at Karnak began to take its enduring shape, an architectural testament to Amun's supremacy and the pharaoh's divine authority. The very scale of these structures, from the towering pylons to the vast hypostyle halls, spoke to a civilization at the height of its power, able to marshal resources, labor, and artistry on a near unimaginable scale. The military strength of the New Kingdom pharaohs was often bolstered by innovations in warfare. Having absorbed lessons from the Hyksos, Egypt adopted the chariot as a key battlefield tool, refining its use and pairing it with skilled archers to devastating effect. The Egyptian army grew more professional, incorporating ranks and logistic systems that allowed for extended campaigns far from the Nile. Yet, this was also a time when war and diplomacy were often two sides of the same coin. Victories were frequently followed by negotiations, and enemies became tributaries, vassals, or even allies through royal intermarriage. By the end of Thutmose III's reign, Egypt had reached a zenith. The empire stretched from the Euphrates River in the north to the fourth cataract of the Nile in the south. It was a superpower in every sense, militarily dominant, economically rich, and spiritually confident. The legacy of these early New Kingdom pharaohs would endure for centuries, their monuments rising like eternal guardians over the desert sands. And yet, even as the empire gleamed under the sun, new changes stirred beneath the surface, changes that would challenge Egypt's spiritual heart and provoke a religious revolution unlike any before. But for now, under the banners of Thutmose, Amenhotep, and their mighty predecessors, the Nile Valley sang with the power of empire and the enduring dream of eternity. As Egypt's empire solidified under the New Kingdom, it was not only military prowess and diplomacy that flourished, but also an outpouring of artistic ambition and religious grandeur. Nowhere was this more vividly realized than in the awe-inspiring temples of Karnak and Luxor, architectural testaments to the Egyptian worldview, a vision of divine order, cosmic harmony and royal majesty etched into stone for eternity. Rising like sacred forests along the east bank of the Nile, these monumental complexes were not merely places of worship. They were centers of power, pageantry, and the timeless connection between gods and men. The Karnak temple complex, begun during the Middle Kingdom but transformed on a colossal scale during the New Kingdom, became the beating spiritual heart of Thebes and of Egypt itself. It was devoted primarily to Amun-Ra, the king of the gods, whose cult had grown in influence after the expulsion of the Hyksos. Stretching over 200 acres, Karnak was more than a single temple. It was a living city of pylons, obelisks, hypostyle halls, sacred lakes, and ceremonial roads. Pharaoh after pharaoh contributed to its expansion, each seeking to leave a mark on this eternal canvas of devotion. The complex was aligned with cosmic principles and was designed as a mirror of the mythological world, a sacred geography where the pharaoh acted as the earthly mediator of divine will. Entering Karnak through its massive stone gateway, one would pass through the great hypostyle hall, a forest of 134 enormous sandstone columns arranged in 16 rows. These towering pillars, many of them rising over 60 feet high, were carved with intricate hieroglyphs celebrating divine acts and royal victories. Light filtered through the clear-story windows above, casting shifting shadows across painted stone, a visual symphony meant to evoke the primordial marshes from which creation itself was born. Standing within, visitors and priests alike would feel dwarfed by the presence of the gods and the majesty of the state. Just to the south, connected by a long avenue lined with Sphinx statues, stood the Temple of Luxor, another jewel of New Kingdom architecture. While Karnak was a domain of grand state ritual, Luxor was dedicated more intimately to the rejuvenation of kingship itself. Every year during the Opet festival, sacred processions carried the cult statues of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu from Karnak to Luxor, symbolically reenacting the divine birth of the pharaoh. Luxor Temple's layout reflected this mythic theme. It was not built for the gods alone, but as a place where divine legitimacy was ritually renewed. In its sanctuaries, the spirit of kingship was reborn again and again, echoing through the dynasties. Pharaohs such as Amenhotep III and Ramses II left particularly profound imprints on these temples. Ramses II, with his love for grandeur, added colossal statues of himself to Luxor's entrance, presenting his image as eternal as the deities he revered. These twin temples, Karnak and Luxor, represented the physical embodiment of Egypt's New Kingdom theology, a world where the pharaoh stood at the center of a divine cosmos, sustaining harmony through ritual, construction, and divine favor. This architectural explosion did not happen in isolation. The apex of temple building paralleled a period of unmatched wealth, art, and prestige across Egypt. Trade routes stretched deep into Africa and across the Near East, bringing exotic goods, incense from Punt, cedar from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Tribute poured in from vassal states, and skilled artisans worked in gold, faience, and carved stone, producing items of remarkable beauty, funerary masks, inlaid jewelry, ceremonial daggers. Tombs of nobles were decorated with vibrant scenes of agriculture, banquets, and sacred rites, providing windows into the rhythms of elite and divine life. The New Kingdom's grandeur was not limited to temples. In nearby Deir el-Medina, a workers' village established to build the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, evidence reveals a literate, organized and well-compensated labor force. These artisans, who lived in well-planned homes and practiced detailed craftsmanship, left behind some of the most intimate and humorous graffiti in ancient Egypt, testaments to the human side of a civilization so often overshadowed by its monuments. It was a time when art flourished not just in temples, but in every corner of society, from the precise brushstrokes on papyrus scrolls to the chiseled hieroglyphs inside tomb walls. These expressions were more than decorative. They were spiritual, political, and eternal. To create was to preserve order, to fight back against chaos, and to join the great river of time that flowed from the gods to the future. In this golden age, Egypt was not only mighty, it was radiant. Its temples rose like mountains of faith, its wealth shimmered like the midday sun on the Nile, and its culture, refined and ordered, cast a long and mesmerizing shadow across the ancient world. But even in the midst of such brilliance, the seeds of future transformation were quietly taking root. For as power concentrated and theology evolved, one pharaoh would soon rise to challenge everything the new kingdom held sacred. In the long river of Egyptian history, few figures stand out as boldly and controversially as Akhenaten, born Amenhotep IV. His reign, beginning around 1353 BCE, marks one of the most extraordinary and enigmatic chapters in ancient Egypt. Where his predecessors sought to build on tradition, Akhenaten sought to rewrite it. His revolution was not waged with armies but with theology and architecture, and its effects rippled across religion, art, and political power. This was a pharaoh who turned his gaze away from Amun and toward a single, radiant force, the Aten, the disk of the sun. Akhenaten's early years followed familiar rhythms. He was born into the royal line of the 18th dynasty, a child of Pharaoh Amenhotep III and Queen Tiye, during a time of prosperity and cultural sophistication. Egypt stood tall among the great powers of the Near East. Yet, as Amenhotep IV matured into pharaoh, he began to diverge dramatically from the norms of Egyptian kingship. Around his fifth regnal year, he initiated a radical shift in the religious landscape. He began to emphasize the worship of Aten, a lesser-known solar deity, as the sole divine force worthy of adoration. He changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten, symbolizing a complete personal and theological transformation. For over a millennium, Egyptian religion had been a carefully woven tapestry of gods and goddesses, each with their domains, stories, and temples. Amun, in particular, had risen from a local Theban deity to become the king of the gods, absorbing aspects of Ra and securing an empire-spanning cult. The priesthood of Amun had become powerful, politically and economically, rivaling even the pharaoh at times. Akhenaten's move toward a monotheistic focus on Aten was not merely spiritual. It was also a challenge to the entrenched power of these temples. Aten was not depicted in the familiar anthropomorphic forms of traditional gods. Instead, he was shown as a simple sun disk with rays extending downwards, each ending in a small hand that reached toward the earth. These rays sometimes held the Ankh, symbol of life, offering divine breath directly to the noses of Akhenaten and his family. This iconography was revolutionary in its simplicity and symbolism. It stripped divinity of human form, removing intermediaries and placing the pharaoh and his family as the only true recipients and conduits of Aten's blessings. Akhenaten didn't stop with theology. He built a city to embody his vision. He founded a brand new capital midway between Thebes and Memphis in a previously undeveloped desert plain. This city, Akhetaten, horizon of the Aten, is known today as Amarna. Constructed with astonishing speed, it was laid out with wide streets, open courtyards and sunlight-filled temples reflecting the openness and radiance of the Aten himself. It was a city without precedent in Egypt's long history, purpose-built not to house the gods of the pantheon, but to serve as the stage for Aten's earthly worship. Within Akhetaten, the royal family was depicted in unprecedented intimacy. Wall reliefs and steles show Akhenaten, his queen Nefertiti, and their children in tender family scenes, kissing, playing, basking in the rays of the Aten. Gone were the stiff and timeless poses of classical pharaonic art. In their place came elongated skulls, protruding stomachs, and languid limbs. Whether this shift represented an artistic renaissance, a new theological symbolism, or even a deliberate physical representation of the royal family's divinely unique nature is still debated among scholars. What is clear is that Akhenaten's reign heralded a deliberate break with the visual, religious, and cultural continuity of Egypt. But outside the shining courtyards of Akhetaten, the old gods and their temples still lingered. In Memphis, Thebes, and the Delta, traditional priesthoods waited. Many Egyptians continued their daily devotions to Osiris, Isis, Amun, and Ra in private or in provincial sanctuaries. Akhenaten's exclusionary focus on Aten and his suppression of other deities, sometimes by erasing their names from monuments, did not sit well with the population or the elite. As a result, while the capital flourished in desert solitude, the ideological divide between Akhetaten and the rest of Egypt widened. In less than 2 decades, the entire edifice of Akhenaten's religious revolution would begin to wobble. The Aten, for all its solar brilliance, could not illuminate the deeper currents of political unrest, economic disruption, and foreign policy neglect that marked the later years of Akhenaten's reign. The Hittites and other rivals grew stronger while Egypt turned inward, focusing on its solar god and its experimental king. Yet, for all its flaws, Akhenaten's religious experiment left a lasting imprint. He was perhaps the first known monotheist in recorded history. His vision, however short-lived, posed a profound question. Could one god truly replace the many in a land so steeped in ritual, myth, and polytheism? As Akhenaten's reign neared its end, so too did the Aten's lonely reign over Egypt. In the shadows of the old temples, a restoration began to stir, one that would return the gods to their thrones and reweave the ancient tapestry that Akhenaten had tried to unthread. As Akhenaten's reign matured, one figure stood prominently at his side, his queen Nefertiti, whose name meant, "The Beautiful One has come." She was no ordinary consort. Nefertiti was portrayed as nearly equal to the king in both artistic and ceremonial representations, and her image appeared across temples and stelae in poses traditionally reserved for pharaohs. Whether making offerings to the Aten or participating in rituals of state, Nefertiti was shown with a divine radiance and a palpable authority, her elongated crown, distinct and elegant, becoming one of the most iconic symbols of ancient Egypt. Nefertiti's origins remain shrouded in mystery. Some scholars suggest she may have been of noble Egyptian blood, possibly the daughter of Ai, a powerful courtier who later became pharaoh himself. Others propose she had foreign origins, perhaps Mitannian, linking her to the broader diplomatic networks of the era. Whatever her beginnings, Nefertiti quickly ascended to a position of exceptional prominence. In a society where royal women often wielded influence from behind the scenes, she emerged fully into the light, praying, governing, and even seemingly sharing in the divine essence that flowed from Aten. Her titles included Great Royal Wife, Lady of All Women, and more unusually, Mistress of Upper and Lower Egypt. Some depictions even show her smiting enemies, a pose almost never assigned to queens. These depictions, coupled with the absence of Akhenaten in some later stelae where she appears alone, have led to speculation that she may have ruled briefly as co-regent, or even pharaoh in her own right after Akhenaten's death. Other theories suggest she adopted a male persona under the name Nefer-Neferiwaten to maintain Atenism's hold during a turbulent interregnum. Still others believe she vanished into seclusion or died unexpectedly, her body and legacy swallowed by the desert's silence. This ambiguity surrounding her fate only deepens the fascination with Nefertiti. Was she a revolutionary queen who challenged gender norms in ancient Egypt? Was she a puppet of Akhenaten's ideology or a strategist in her own right? The fact that her tomb has never been definitively found only adds to her mystique. In recent years, tantalizing radar scans of Tutankhamun's tomb suggested hidden chambers that might house her remains, but no conclusive discovery has yet emerged. As the years passed in Akhetaten, the experimental city that bore Aten's name, Egypt's strength began to wither beneath the weight of theological zeal. While Atenism dominated official doctrine, the wider empire started to unravel. Diplomatic correspondence from the famous Amarna letters, clay tablets preserved in Akhetaten, reveal increasing desperation from Egyptian vassals in Canaan and Syria, pleading for support against foreign threats. The pharaoh, seemingly preoccupied with divine devotion, failed to act decisively, and Egypt's influence in the region began to erode. After Akhenaten's death, around 1336 BCE, the solar utopia he had built began to dissolve swiftly. Atenism had never taken deep root among the populace. Its singular devotion to an abstract deity, with no temples open to ordinary people and no comforting mythologies of the afterlife, failed to inspire lasting loyalty. Within just a few years, the city of Akhetaten was abandoned, left to the sand and vultures, its walls still bearing the fading images of sunlit royal scenes. The collapse of Akhenaten's reforms was both swift and deliberate. His successor, perhaps Smenkhkare or even Nefertiti under a different name, ruled only briefly. But soon a young boy ascended to the throne, Tutankhaten, who changed his name to Tutankhamun, signaling a return to the old gods. The temples of Amun were reopened, priests reinstated, and the god's name, once banned, was inscribed again across Egypt's monuments. The cult of Aten was systematically erased. Statues of Akhenaten were defaced, his name chiseled out from stone walls, and the capital he built was left to crumble in silence. Even the historical records attempted to forget him. Later, king lists omitted Akhenaten's name entirely, viewing his reign as a heresy, an aberration in the divine order. His bold experiment in monotheism was not just reversed, it was buried, literally and figuratively, under layers of cultural amnesia. For centuries, his story lay hidden until the ruins of Amarna and the hauntingly expressive art of his reign were rediscovered in modern times. Despite its dramatic end, Akhenaten's revolution left behind profound questions. His religious reformation, unique in the ancient world, marked the first known attempt to centralize spiritual life around a single god. Whether inspired by mysticism, political strategy, or personal conviction, his vision challenged the very foundations of Egyptian religion and kingship. Nefertiti, his partner in this vision, remains a tantalizing enigma, poised between goddess and queen, ruler and shadow. Together, their reign was a fleeting blaze of sunlight across the vast twilight of ancient Egypt's religious traditions. And although the Aten's rays faded from the temples, the story of Akhenaten and Nefertiti endures, a tale of devotion, ambition, and the fragility of even the boldest dreams when set against the march of time. In the wake of Akhenaten's radical religious reforms and the abandonment of Akhetaten, the kingdom of Egypt yearned for a return to order, familiarity, and divine balance. Into this moment of upheaval stepped a boy no older than 9, Tutankhaten, later known to history as Tutankhamun. His ascension to the throne around 1332 BCE marked not just the beginning of a young pharaoh's reign, but the symbolic restoration of Egypt's traditional values and pantheon. The child king would become one of the most famous names in Egyptian history, not for his political achievements, but for what his life, death, and rediscovery would later reveal about an ancient civilization's attempt to reclaim itself from the shadow of monotheism. Tutankhamun was likely the son of Akhenaten, though his exact lineage remains a topic of scholarly debate. His mother may have been a secondary wife, or possibly Akhenaten's sister, reflecting the royal family's complex intermarriages. Regardless, his childhood was spent amid the crumbling ruins of his father's religious experiment. The boy would have known a world where the sun disk Aten was worshipped above all, temples to Amun stood empty, and the old priesthood had been disbanded. But soon after becoming pharaoh, likely under the guidance of powerful advisors such as Ai and Horemheb, Tutankhaten began to steer Egypt back toward its spiritual roots. One of his earliest official acts was a significant one. He changed his name from Tutankhaten, meaning living image of Aten, to Tutankhamun, or living image of Amun. This shift was more than nominal. It was a declaration that the suppressed god Amun was once again supreme and that the old religious order would be restored. Polytheism, with its rich tapestry of deities, rituals, and local traditions, was once again enshrined at the heart of Egyptian life. The temples of Amun at Thebes were reopened. Statues, inscriptions, and priesthoods that had been purged under Akhenaten were reinstated. Efforts were made to erase the memory of the Amarna heresy, and the new administration issued proclamations reaffirming the divine roles of multiple gods, Osiris, Isis, Ra, Horus, and others, who together maintained the Ma'at, the cosmic order so vital to Egyptian thought. Though only a child, Tutankhamun's reign was thus defined by this restoration of polytheism and the careful reconstruction of what had been disrupted. Royal inscriptions and stelae from his time present him as a pious ruler working to mend the spiritual and societal fabric torn by his predecessor. These depictions, while idealized, suggest that his reign served as a bridge between the ideological extremes of Akhenaten and the more pragmatic, militaristic rule that would follow. Behind the throne, senior officials likely controlled much of the state's daily affairs. I, who held the title of vizier and would eventually become pharaoh himself, and Horemheb, the commander-in-chief of the army, were instrumental in shaping policies during the young king's reign. Their influence ensured continuity and a smooth transition toward a more centralized and stable government, preparing the stage for the new kingdom's next chapter. Tutankhamun's short life, he died around age 18 or 19, was not marked by major conquests or radical reforms. Yet in that brevity lay the seeds of immortality. His modest achievements, when viewed against the grandeur of rulers like Ramses II or Thutmose III, may seem small. But his role as the restorer of balance, the boy pharaoh who reopened the temples and brought the gods back to their people, granted him a unique place in the hearts of later Egyptians. Perhaps unknowingly, Tutankhamun stood as a symbol of reconciliation between tradition and innovation, between royal divinity and mortal vulnerability. In a world that had been briefly thrown off course, his reign offered the reassurance of the familiar, the sacred rhythms of the past, gently returning to their rightful place. Though he was still learning to rule, still growing into his royal role, his presence alone signaled that Egypt had endured the storm and emerged once more, anchored by the eternal gods of the Nile. In the next part of his story, the drama would shift from life to legacy, as the world would rediscover this nearly forgotten pharaoh over 3,000 years later. His burial, untouched and radiant, holding secrets of an age once thought lost to time. But even before the discovery of his tomb, Tutankhamun had already fulfilled a role far greater than his youth might suggest. He had restored Egypt's gods to their thrones and ensured the continuity of a civilization built upon divine harmony. In the Valley of the Kings, on the west bank of the Nile, across from ancient Thebes, time slumbered undisturbed for over 3 millennia. Until the year 1922, when a determined English archaeologist, Howard Carter, would pry open a doorway that led not only to a tomb, but to the heart of a civilization long buried beneath layers of desert, sand, and myth. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, nearly intact and filled with unimaginable treasures, rekindled the world's fascination with ancient Egypt and elevated the boy king from an obscure historical figure to a symbol of ancient splendor. Carter's excavation, funded by Lord Carnarvon, was the culmination of years of searching in the Valley of the Kings. Many believed the area had been thoroughly explored, but Carter's meticulous work led him to an undisturbed set of steps hidden beneath the debris of later construction. What he found was a sealed doorway bearing the faint imprint of Tutankhamun's name, a name long forgotten, nearly erased from history by the successors who sought to distance themselves from the Amarna period. When Carter famously peered through a small hole in the tomb's entrance and was asked what he saw, he simply replied, "Wonderful things." Inside lay an astonishing trove of over 5,000 artifacts, a golden chariot, alabaster jars, ceremonial weapons, exquisite jewelry, and, at the heart of it all, the now iconic golden funerary mask of the boy king. The mask, with its serene expression and inlaid lapis lazuli, became a global emblem of Egypt's mystique, its craftsmanship reflecting the society's obsession with continuity, beauty, and the divine. Unlike the grander tombs of older pharaohs, Tutankhamun's final resting place was relatively modest in size. It may have originally been intended for someone of lesser status, hastily adapted when the young king died unexpectedly. Yet its preservation, likely due to its concealed location and the fact that it remained sealed from looters, offered an unparalleled snapshot of 18th dynasty burial practices. The tomb provided remarkable insight into daily life and spiritual belief in ancient Egypt. Miniature boats spoke of the journey to the afterlife. Food offerings and wine jars suggested the king would require sustenance beyond death. Board games, linens, and even a lock of his grandmother's hair were buried with him, signifying personal affection and the hope for comfort in the hereafter. The placement of each item reflected a society meticulously attuned to ritual and symbolism, where death was not an end, but a transition to a new, eternal existence. Importantly, the tomb also revealed the advanced nature of Egyptian artistry and religious ideology. Each object was both functional and sacred. The funerary texts inscribed on walls and coffins, spells from the Book of the Dead, were meant to guide Tutankhamun safely through the perilous underworld. The tomb, in essence, was a carefully curated universe, a microcosm of divine order, created to sustain the king's soul for eternity. The global reaction to the tomb's discovery was immediate and electrifying. Newspapers splashed images of golden artifacts across their pages. Museums rushed to create exhibitions. A wave of Egyptomania swept through Europe and America, influencing everything from fashion to architecture. In The Boy King, the world rediscovered a piece of its own ancient soul, reminded that beneath centuries of dust lay not just bones, but a living legacy of thought, art, and sacred memory. Tutankhamun's tomb also became the center of myths and legends. Reports of a curse after Lord Carnarvon's sudden death fueled sensational headlines, though no such curse appears in any authentic Egyptian text. Nevertheless, the aura of mystery surrounding the tomb only enhanced its legendary status. Today, Tutankhamun remains one of the most recognizable names in world history, not because of military triumphs or great public works, but because his tomb survived the centuries as a perfect time capsule. His legacy is now inseparable from the story of archaeology itself, a reminder that the past is never truly lost. It waits, hidden for rediscovery. In many ways, Tutankhamun became the eternal messenger of his civilization. His preserved tomb taught us about the fragility of youth, the weight of kingship, and the immortality of memory. Through him, Egypt once again whispered its ancient truths into the ears of the modern world, reminding us that glory is not always measured in conquests, but sometimes in the still silence of a sealed chamber and the treasures it guards in the name of eternity. In the grand symphony of Egypt's ancient dynasties, one name echoes louder than almost any other: Ramses II, remembered by posterity as Ramses the Great. Reigning for an astonishing 66 years, from 1279 to 1213 BCE during the 19th dynasty, Ramses stood at the pinnacle of Egyptian imperial power, prestige, and propaganda. His era came to define the essence of New Kingdom grandeur, lavish, expansive, and deeply self-assured. Through his temples, inscriptions, and diplomatic achievements, Ramses would cement his name not only in stone, but in the memory of all who followed. Born into a lineage of military prestige, Ramses was the son of Seti I, a powerful and capable ruler in his own right. From an early age, Ramses was groomed for leadership, taking part in military campaigns and assuming titles of command even before he officially ascended the throne. Once crowned pharaoh, Ramses launched a reign marked by both aggressive expansion and masterful consolidation. He sought to restore Egypt's waning influence in Asia and maintain dominance over vassal states that were beginning to slip from Egypt's control. One of the most defining moments of his military career, and perhaps the most famous battle in all of Egyptian history, was the Battle of Kadesh. Fought around 1274 BCE, this confrontation saw Ramses lead his army against the Hittite Empire, a formidable power based in Anatolia. The city of Kadesh, located near the Orontes River in present-day Syria, was a strategic linchpin both empires sought to dominate. Ramses, ever the confident commander, marched with a sizable force northward. However, the campaign did not proceed as planned. The Hittites, under King Muwatalli II, laid a clever trap, deceiving Ramses about their true location and ambushing part of the Egyptian force. Ramses, separated from the bulk of his army, found himself in grave danger. What followed, according to Egyptian records, was a heroic personal stand. Inscriptions and reliefs depict the pharaoh rallying his troops and charging into the fray with divine vigor, turning the tide of battle through sheer will and valor. Though Ramses declared it a resounding victory, modern historians view the Battle of Kadesh as more of a stalemate with heavy losses on both sides. Nonetheless, it demonstrated Ramses's boldness and charisma as a military leader, and more importantly, his unmatched skill in controlling the narrative. Temples across Egypt, including the massive walls of Abu Simbel and Ramesseum, were inscribed with dramatic scenes of the battle, portraying Ramses as a warrior king favored by the gods, charging alone into chaos, protected by divine light. But beyond the battlefield, Ramses achieved something unprecedented, the world's first known peace treaty. Years after Kadesh, the Egyptians and Hittites, weary from repeated clashes and rising internal threats, entered diplomatic negotiations. Around 1258 BCE, Ramses and the Hittite king Hattusili III formalized a treaty written in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform. The agreement included mutual pledges of non-aggression, military assistance, and extradition of fugitives. It was a masterstroke of diplomacy and remains the earliest surviving international peace accord in history. Ramses's legacy, however, extended far beyond warfare and treaties. His era was characterized by an unprecedented surge in architectural ambition. From the monumental temples of Abu Simbel, carved directly into a cliff face to honor both himself and his queen Nefertari, to the sprawling Ramesseum in Thebes, Ramses transformed the landscape of Egypt with his colossal vision. Statues of himself were erected across the land, some standing over 60 feet tall, depicting the pharaoh not merely as a man, but as a living god in eternal communion with the divine. This age of monumentality was not just about ego, it was also about messaging. Ramses understood the power of architecture as propaganda. Every wall told a story. Every statue reinforced divine kingship. In a world without mass media, these structures spoke to the Egyptian people across generations, proclaiming stability, power, and religious harmony. Even as Ramses aged well into his 80s, an extraordinary feat to the time, he remained active in governance, building, and diplomacy. He fathered more than 100 children and saw many of them take up influential positions, ensuring dynastic continuity. To later generations, Ramses became a benchmark of greatness. His name, rendered in Greek as Ozymandias, was immortalized by poets such as Shelley, who saw in the shattered remnants of Ramses's colossal statues both a tribute to past glory and a meditation on time's decay. But in his own time, Ramses the Great stood as a beacon of permanence, a pharaoh who dared to etch his legacy into the face of time itself. Through diplomacy and war, through temples and treaties, he did not merely rule Egypt, he defined an era of ambition, endurance, and eternal grandeur. After the dust of Kadesh and the ink of the world's first peace treaty had settled, Ramses II turned his creative energies to stone and story, crafting a legacy designed to tower over time itself. Nowhere is this ambition more vividly realized than in the colossal temples of Abu Simbel, hewn directly from a sandstone cliff on Egypt's southern frontier. Situated far up the Nile near the Second Cataract, the twin temples were both a declaration of divine power to Nubia and a beacon to travelers entering Egypt's domain. 4 seated colossi, each over 20 meters high and each bearing the serene, unmistakable features of Ramses, gaze eastward toward the rising sun. Their sheer scale arrests the desert silence, proclaiming to all who pass, "Here reigns a king as enduring as the cliffs themselves." Inside the great temple, reliefs depict Ramses in eternal triumph, smoting foes, riding his chariot and standing before the gods as their chosen equal. The inner sanctuary is aligned so that twice a year the first rays of dawn pierce the rock-cut corridor to illuminate the statues of Ramses and the gods Amun-Ra and Ra-Harakti, leaving only Ptah, lord of the underworld, in shadow. It is a cosmic choreography that binds architecture to astronomy, reinforcing Ramses' claim to divine harmony. Adjacent stands the smaller yet exquisitely refined temple dedicated to the Queen Nefertari and the goddess Hathor. Rarely had an Egyptian ruler so honored his consort, placing her likeness, towering, elegant, and equal in stature, beside his own. By immortalizing their partnership in stone, Ramses not only exalted Nefertari, but advertised a royal union blessed by the gods, a union that underscored the stability and prosperity of his reign. While Abu Simbel projected Egypt's majesty to the south, the pharaoh lavished equal attention on the spiritual heartland of Thebes, specifically the sprawling precinct of Karnak. Building upon the work of his predecessors, Ramses completed pylons, obelisks, and colossal courts, linking his name irrevocably to the sanctuary of Amun-Ra. He commissioned a vast hypostyle hall with walls carved in shimmering detail, chronicling not only the feats at Kadesh, but provincial triumphs, processions, and offerings. Every block became a billboard of royal legitimacy. In Ramses' Egypt, to worship was to remember him. To approach Karnak's towering pylons was to walk through narratives of his unrivaled kingship. Such relentless self-promotion was no accident. Ramses II understood the power of propaganda better than any pharaoh before him. In an era without printing presses or coinage, stone, papyrus, and oral recitation became his media empire. He ordered the duplication of monumental battle scenes across multiple temples, from Luxor to Abydos, to saturate the landscape with his heroic image. Even the obelisks he erected were inscribed with claims of divine favor and military supremacy, their gilded tips flashing his name in the sunlight for miles around. Yet Ramses' propaganda was not solely martial. He cast himself as the benevolent husband of the two lands. issuing grand building programs that repaired canals, stocked granaries, and adorned provincial towns with statues and stelae. By linking civic welfare to his patronage, he fostered a reciprocal loyalty. The people flourished because of Ramses, and Ramses endured through the people's gratitude. This dynamic, sealed in festivals such as the Opet and Sed Jubilees, perpetuated the mythos of an ageless, tireless ruler, an image so potent that later pharaohs would struggle to match it. Generations after his death, Egyptians spoke of Ramses II as the great ancestor. His statues served as talismans of continuity during the turbulent centuries that followed. Foreign rulers who later seized Egypt often invoked his legacy to legitimize their own authority. Even the Bible may preserve echoes of his grandeur in the unnamed pharaoh of the Exodus. For the modern world, he embodies the apogee of Egypt's imperial power and artistic vision. That towering reputation also crystallizes a poignant reality. Ramses II is widely regarded as Egypt's last truly great pharaoh. After his reign, the new kingdom would slowly erode under economic strain, external pressures, and internal division. Monumental projects dwindled, vassal states broke free, and priestly power began to eclipse royal authority. None who followed, though some tried, matched Ramses' blend of longevity, ambition, and propagandistic genius. His reign became a sunset moment, dazzling, expansive, but heralding a night in which Egypt's star would gradually dim. Today, the temples of Abu Simbel, rescued from the rising waters of Lake Nasser in the 1960s and relocated block by block, stand as a testament to humankind's will to remember greatness. Karnak's colonnades still echo with the inscriptions of his deeds, and among the shifting sands, colossal fragments of his statues lie half-buried, solemn reminders of Shelley's immortal lines on Ozymandias, yet also enduring proofs of a king who carved his essence into eternity. In Ramses II, we see both the zenith of Egyptian monumentality and the enduring echo of a civilization that, through stone and story, refused to be forgotten. Following the long, luminous reign of Ramses II, Egypt began a slow descent from the heights of its golden age into an era marked by division, foreign threats, and a gradual erosion of centralized authority. The transition did not occur in a single moment, nor was it defined by cataclysm. Instead, it unfolded like a drawn-out exhale after centuries of empire-building, wealth, and divine kingship. The pharaohs who followed Ramses the Great struggled to maintain the same control over the two lands, and many proved unable or unwilling to live up to the grand legacy left before them. After Ramses' death, the throne passed to a string of successors, including his son Merenptah, and eventually to the lesser-known Ramses III, who ruled during the early 20th dynasty. While Ramses III did achieve victories and public works of his own, the growing administrative demands of empire, combined with famine, internal corruption, and mounting religious authority, slowly unraveled the structure of power. The once tightly held grip of the pharaohs loosened. Regional leaders began asserting more control. And in Thebes, the religious capital of Upper Egypt, the high priests of Amun, once loyal servants of the crown, grew in wealth, status, and influence, eventually becoming rulers in all but name. These priests, clad in ceremonial finery and backed by temple estates and their own militias, managed vast resources and wielded spiritual authority that rivaled and at times surpassed that of the royal court. Their growing dominance created a dual system of power. While nominal pharaohs ruled from the delta city of Tanis in Lower Egypt, Thebes functioned as a semi-autonomous theocracy in the south. Egypt was not officially split, but it operated as two distinct spheres, each with its own ruling elite, each claiming legitimacy. This internal fragmentation weakened Egypt's ability to defend its borders, making it increasingly vulnerable to external pressures. One of the most enigmatic and destructive forces to descend upon the ancient world during this period came not from the deserts or the known empires of the Near East, but from the sea. Around the 12th century BCE, a mysterious confederation of raiders known to history as the Sea Peoples launched waves of assaults across the eastern Mediterranean. Their origins remain debated. Some scholars suggest they came from the Aegean, others from Anatolia or displaced areas of the Balkans, but their impact was unmistakable. These maritime warriors attacked major cities, disrupted trade routes, and brought chaos to the coastal civilizations of the Levant, Anatolia, and beyond. Egypt, too, was not spared. During the reign of Ramses III, the Sea Peoples turned their attention southward, launching both land and naval invasions. Inscriptions on the walls of Medinet Habu, Ramses III's mortuary temple in Thebes, provide vivid accounts of these battles. The reliefs depict chaotic scenes of warships clashing, archers raining down arrows, and the pharaoh leading his troops to repel the invasion. Ramses' inscriptions proclaim a decisive victory. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands, but their hearts and their souls are finished forever. Yet the cost of this triumph was high. Though Egypt repelled the invaders, the economic and social toll was immense. Grain shortages and labor strikes followed. Administrative efficiency declined. The victory did not restore Egypt's strength, but rather marked one of its last acts of centralized defense. The state would never fully recover. Following Ramses III's death, assassinated in a palace conspiracy, the remaining kings of the 20th dynasty grew weaker, with reigns that were shorter and increasingly powerless. By the start of the 21st dynasty, Egypt was a land in twilight. Foreign mercenaries, particularly Libyans, began integrating into the military and administration. The priesthood of Amun solidified its rule in Thebes, even mummifying its own high priests and burying them in royal style. In the Delta, pharaohs continued to claim divine rule, but their power was localized and often symbolic. Thus began the Third Intermediate Period, a time of fractured authority, shift in allegiances, and increasing dependence on non-native rulers. While pyramids were no longer built and monumental temples slowed in construction, the people of Egypt carried on. Craftsmen, scribes, farmers, and merchants continued to live, worship, and record their lives, often under multiple overlapping authorities. Invasions had come and gone, but perhaps the more lasting change was internal, the slow replacement of a unified divine kingship with a complex mosaic of religious, military, and regional powers. It was no longer one Egypt, but many, still alive, still proud, yet no longer eternal in the way the old and new kingdoms had once seemed. And though the Sea Peoples would vanish into the fog of history, their legacy as agents of disruption lingered in the fragmented echoes of a civilization that once ruled as gods upon the earth. As Egypt struggled to retain the echoes of its imperial past, The weakening grasp of central power began to show itself most clearly in the north. Following the turbulent reign of Ramses III and the disruptive invasions of the Sea Peoples, the pharaonic institution lost much of its former reach. The once powerful Egyptian state, which had stretched into Canaan, Syria, and Nubia, now found itself confined and fractured. No longer a dominant empire, Egypt was now a collection of rival powers, often dependent on foreign alliances or subject to foreign rule altogether. The Nile Delta, the region traditionally rich in trade and strategically vital, became the focal point of Egypt's diminishing influence. With fewer resources allocated to the military and a fragile economy weakened by internal division, Egypt could no longer effectively project strength beyond its borders. The vassal states in the Levant, once firmly under Egyptian sway during the New Kingdom, either broke away or fell to more aggressive neighbors like the Assyrians and Hittites. Egyptian garrisons were recalled or overrun, and tribute from abroad ceased. In practical terms, Egypt had retreated from the stage of Near Eastern politics, replaced by new players in an evolving geopolitical order. Internally, this withdrawal was mirrored by a growing decentralization that sapped what remained of national unity. Egypt was not so much conquered as it was gradually disassembled from within and without. As one region slipped away, others followed. The country's northern cities like Tanis, Mendes, and Bubastis became the seats of local dynasties and powerful warlords, many of them of Libyan descent. These Libyan tribes, initially immigrants, mercenaries, and settlers, had been slowly absorbed into Egyptian society over the generations. By the dawn of the 22nd dynasty circa 945 BCE, they had firmly embedded themselves in the political framework. Libyan chieftains, notably Shoshenq I, seized the opportunity provided by Egypt's vacuum of power. Shoshenq would go on to declare himself pharaoh and establish the so-called Libyan dynasty, ruling from the city of Bubastis. He legitimized his reign by adopting Egyptian religious customs, monumental architecture, and royal titles. In many respects, the Libyan rulers continued traditional Egyptian governance, erecting temples and supporting the priesthood, but their origins and loyalties reflected a broader shift. Egypt was now being led by men whose bloodlines were not native to the Nile. The Libyan rulers faced a fractured land. In Upper Egypt, the high priests of Amun retained autonomous rule, further weakening any hope for national consolidation. Egypt became a checkerboard of semi-independent domains, sometimes cooperating, often in conflict. Rival kings might rule simultaneously in Thebes, Heracleopolis, and Tanis, each claiming divine legitimacy, but none possessing real national control. This fragmentation laid the groundwork for a succession of foreign interventions. From the south came the Nubians, who had long lived in Egypt's shadow and had adopted many of its customs, language, and religious practices. Their kingdom, centered in Napata, grew strong as Egypt faltered. By the 8th century BCE, the Nubian kings saw themselves not as foreigners, but as rightful inheritors of Egypt's ancient traditions. In a dramatic reversal of roles, Egypt, once the imperial overlord of Nubia, now found itself vulnerable to conquest from the very lands it had once dominated. The Nubian king Pi launched a series of campaigns that culminated in the reunification of Egypt under the 25th dynasty, often called the Kushite dynasty. Piet's inscriptions speak of his disgust at the chaos of the fragmented land and his belief in restoring divine order. His successors, including Taharqa, would rule both Egypt and Kush, creating a unique hybrid court steeped in old Egyptian symbolism but grounded in Nubian heritage. Yet their rule, too, would be short-lived. To the northeast, the growing might of the Assyrian Empire cast a long shadow. The Assyrians, with their advanced military and ruthless campaigns, had begun to dominate the Near East. Egypt, under Nubian kings, inevitably came into conflict with this rising power. By the mid-7th century BCE, Assyrian forces invaded, sacking cities and driving the Kushite rulers back into Nubia. Egypt was left in the hands of puppet rulers, often native princes propped up by Assyrian decree. With the Assyrian invasions, Egypt entered yet another chapter of diminished autonomy. Although some local dynasties continued to claim kingship and brief resurgences occurred, the country remained subject to external influence, whether through direct control or economic domination. The grandeur of the pyramids and temples stood in stark contrast to the political realities. Egypt was no longer the eternal kingdom of old, but a fractured land where foreign rulers shaped its destiny. The Third Intermediate Period had begun as a time of internal decay, but ended as a prologue to centuries of foreign domination. The Libyans, Nubians, and Assyrians each left their imprint, altering the face of Egypt while preserving, in part, its memory. And yet, through it all, the Nile continued its eternal journey, carrying with it fragments of a once unified past. As Egypt emerged from the turbulence of the Third Intermediate Period, its once unquestioned sovereignty had already been tested by Libyans, Nubians, and Assyrians. Yet more formidable powers loomed on the horizon, poised to write the final chapters of pharaonic history. The first of these came from the vast empire of Persia. In 525 BCE, King Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, marched his armies westward. At the Battle of Pelusium, on the Nile's eastern frontier, Persian forces confronted the troops of Pharaoh Psamtik III. According to later Greek accounts, Cambyses used Egypt's own symbolism against it, reportedly placing sacred animals, perhaps cats, at the front lines to deter Egyptian archers. Whether myth or tactic, the result was decisive. Egypt fell, and Cambyses crowned himself pharaoh, inaugurating the 27th dynasty, the first Persian domination of the Nile. Persian rule introduced imperial governors, or satraps, who levied taxes for distant Persepolis. Temples continued their rituals, but the pharaoh now spoke a foreign tongue. Egypt retained its culture beneath layers of Persian administration, yet many Egyptians viewed this period as a twilight season. Pyramids still touched the sky, but the divine aura of native rule had dimmed. Brief flickers of independence returned under pharaohs Amertius and Nectanebo II, yet Persia reclaimed control in 343 BCE. Only a new, unexpected conqueror would finally break the cycle. That conqueror was Alexander the Great. In 332 BCE, fresh from victories in Asia Minor and the Levant, the youthful Macedonian marched into Egypt as a liberator rather than an invader. Welcomed as the one who had overthrown Persian oppression, Alexander traveled to Memphis, sacrificed to Apis, and sailed down the western branch of the Nile to a windswept village near the Mediterranean. There he founded Alexandria, envisioning a city that would fuse Greek intellect with Egyptian heritage. In the western desert, he made a pilgrimage to the oracle of Ammon at Siwa, where priests reportedly hailed him as the son of Zeus Ammon, blending Greek and Egyptian divinity in a single breath. Though Alexander left Egypt after only a few months, his brief presence reshaped its destiny. Upon Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his empire fractured among his generals. Egypt fell to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's trusted companions, who declared himself Ptolemy the First Savior. Thus began the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of Greek rulers who styled themselves as traditional pharaohs while speaking Greek in court and sponsoring Greek culture. Their capital, Alexandria, grew into a glittering metropolis. A lighthouse at Pharos guided ships across the sea. The great library gathered scrolls from every known civilization. The Mouseion hosted scholars who calculated the circumference of Earth and catalogued the stars. At the same time, Ptolemies restored temples along the Nile, inscribed their names in hieroglyphs, and presented themselves to native priests as rightful heirs to Osiris and Ra. Egypt became a mosaic of cultures. Greek theatres stood beside Egyptian pylons, and traders spoke in a dozen languages in the shadow of obelisks. Yet dynastic harmony often faltered. Palace intrigues, sibling rivalries, and regional revolts punctuated Ptolemaic rule. By the 1st century BCE, the kingdom's power had waned, buffeted by civil wars and the rise in might of Rome. Into this storm stepped Cleopatra the 7th Philopator, born in 69 BCE, the last queen of the Ptolemaic line. Unlike many of her ancestors, Cleopatra embraced Egypt's language as well as its symbols. She studied chemistry, philosophy, and rhetoric, reportedly speaking Greek, Egyptian, and several Near Eastern tongues. Ascending the throne in 51 BCE, alongside her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, she faced immediate challenges: palace factions, economic strain, and the looming shadow of Rome's republic. Fate intertwined Cleopatra's destiny with Rome's when Julius Caesar pursued his rival Pompey to Alexandria in 48 BCE. Legend tells that Cleopatra, barred from Caesar's presence by her brother's advisors, had herself smuggled into the palace, wrapped in a carpet or perhaps a linen sack, unfurled before the Roman general as a living appeal. Enchanted by her intelligence and political acumen, Caesar allied with Cleopatra, defeating Ptolemy XIII and restoring her to the throne. Their union produced a son, Caesarion, whom Cleopatra presented as the living link between Egyptian royalty and Roman greatness. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, the Mediterranean plunged into fresh turmoil. Cleopatra aligned with Mark Antony, Caesar's friend and leading member of Rome's second triumvirate. Antony and Cleopatra's partnership was both strategic and romantic, entwining Egypt's resources with Antony's imperial ambitions. Together, they envisioned a Mediterranean empire spanning east and west, symbolized by lavish processions in Alexandria and grand pronouncements of shared sovereignty. Yet in Rome, Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, cast their alliance as a threat to Roman tradition, portraying Cleopatra as a foreign enchantress bent on subjugating Rome. The confrontation culminated at Actium in 31 BCE, where Octavian's fleet shattered Antony and Cleopatra's naval forces. Retreating to Egypt, the lovers faced inevitable defeat. In August of 30 BCE, Antony, misled by false news of Cleopatra's death, fell upon his sword. Cleopatra, resolute to avoid humiliation in Octavian's triumph, followed him in death, according to legend, by the bite of an asp. With her passing, the line of pharaohs, stretching back 3 millennia to Narmer, finally ended. Egypt became a Roman province, its grain feeding emperors and legions, its temples still echoing prayers to gods now subject to foreign rule. Yet Cleopatra's legacy, like that of Egypt itself, endured. She was remembered not merely as a tragic beauty, but as a sovereign who navigated the currents of empire with wit and will. Through her, the final spark of pharaonic Egypt flared bright before the long night of occupation. And though Rome claimed the Nile, the river's ancient spirit continued to flow, whispering of dynasties, gods, and queens who once held the world in awe. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE marked not only a turning point in Roman history, but a defining moment in the long twilight of ancient Egypt. It was here, along the western coast of Greece, that the fate of Cleopatra VII and her ally Mark Antony collided with the ambitions of Octavian, the future Augustus Caesar. For Egypt, this was not merely a battle over maritime supremacy or personal rivalries. It was the final defense of its sovereignty, the last breath of a civilization that had endured for over 3 millennia. Cleopatra had wagered everything on her alliance with Mark Antony, a powerful Roman general who had inherited control of the eastern provinces following the death of Julius Caesar. Together, they had envisioned a shared empire, one that would bridge Roman authority with Egyptian wealth and prestige. Their union was more than romantic, it was strategic. Cleopatra brought with her the immense resources of Egypt, the grain of the Nile, the gold of Nubia, and the prestige of divine kingship. In return, Antony offered military support and a vision of political autonomy separate from the increasingly dictatorial ambitions of Octavian in Rome. But to Octavian, this alliance was a dangerous affront. He painted Cleopatra not as a sovereign partner, but as a foreign seductress, manipulating a Roman leader to her will and threatening the moral fabric of the Republic. Roman propaganda took full advantage of the narrative. Cleopatra became the embodiment of Eastern decadence, and Antony was cast as a traitor to Roman virtue. As tensions escalated, both sides prepared for an inevitable showdown. The naval confrontation at Actium was decisive. Cleopatra and Antony's forces were larger but poorly coordinated. Their fleet consisted of massive ships laden with troops and wealth, while Octavian's admiral, Agrippa, employed smaller, faster vessels that could outmaneuver the enemy. During the heat of the battle, Cleopatra's ships suddenly disengaged and fled southward, reportedly taking Antony's fleet with her in a confused and hasty retreat. Historians debate whether this was a planned maneuver or a panic-induced collapse, but the outcome was clear. Octavian emerged victorious. The vast eastern holdings of Antony and Cleopatra crumbled, and Rome claimed ascendancy over the Mediterranean. In the aftermath, Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Egypt, taking refuge in the palace at Alexandria. The mood was somber, the realization grim. Octavian followed, his legions marching ever closer. As Alexandria fell, Antony, believing Cleopatra had taken her own life, thrust his sword into his body. When he discovered the truth, he was taken to her side, where he died in her arms. Cleopatra, unwilling to be paraded through Rome as a chained trophy in Octavian's triumph, chose her own fate. The exact method remains a mystery. Popular legend says she allowed a venomous asp to bite her, though some scholars suggest poison hidden in a hairpin or ointment. However it occurred, Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE marked the definitive end of the pharaonic age. With her passing, Egypt lost its last native monarch. The line of pharaohs, stretching from the mythic Nama to the mighty Ramses to the enigmatic Cleopatra, was severed. Octavian claimed Egypt not as just another Roman province, but as his personal domain, recognizing its unique wealth and strategic importance. He appointed a prefect to govern in his stead, ensuring that Egypt remained outside the authority of the Roman Senate. The temples continued their rites, priests still honored the ancient gods, and the Nile still flooded with divine rhythm, but the soul of Egypt was now bound to an empire centered in faraway Rome. The annexation of Egypt was not merely a political shift, but a cultural transition. Greek and Roman customs increasingly dominated public life, even as Egyptian traditions persisted in rural temples and domestic spaces. Hieroglyphs began to fade, replaced by Greek script and Latin administration. The sacred language of the priests retreated into the shadows, eventually lost to time until its rediscovery centuries later through the Rosetta Stone. And yet, even as the formal reign of the pharaohs ended, Egypt's legacy endured. Cleopatra's dramatic life and tragic death became the subject of plays, poems, and portraits. Roman emperors styled themselves as Egyptian rulers when visiting Alexandria. The image of Egypt as a land of mystery and majesty continued to captivate the imagination of the world, long after its crowns had been buried and its gods displaced. The end of pharaonic Egypt was not a simple collapse, but a transformation. The spirit of the Nile lived on, in the architecture of Roman temples that mimicked Egyptian columns, in the scrolls studied by Alexandrian scholars under Roman patronage, and in the eternal fascination Egypt would inspire across the ages. It was no longer ruled by pharaohs, but it remained, unmistakably, the land of the gods and the river that birthed time itself. Long after the voices of the pharaohs had fallen silent and the last priests of Isis had shuttered their sanctuaries, the sands of Egypt lay dreamlike beneath a veil of time. Obelisks thrust skyward from buried cities, forgotten temples slumbered beneath drifting dunes, and the hieroglyphs that once sang hymns to Ra and Osiris stood mute, beautiful, inscrutable, and longing to be heard again. For centuries, travelers from distant lands gazed upon these relics with wonder, yet the deeper meanings remained locked away. It would take a sequence of discoveries and the relentless curiosity of modern minds to awaken Egypt once more in the world's imagination. The first great stirrings of this rediscovery came at the turn of the 19th century, when Napoleon Bonaparte launched his Egyptian campaign in 1802-1798. Although military success proved elusive, the expedition carried with it a corps of scholars, scientists, artists, and engineers, known as the savants. Their task was to catalogue the natural and cultural riches of Egypt. The results, published later as the monumental Description de l'Égypte, revealed to Europe an astonishing panorama of temples, tombs, statues, and inscriptions. Detailed engravings of Luxor, Karnak, and the pyramids captivated the public, igniting a fervor that would soon be known as Egyptomania. For the first time since antiquity, Egypt's ruins stepped into the daylight of scholarly inquiry, inspiring poets, architects, and collectors across the continent. Yet even as Napoleon's artists recorded the glories of the Nile, the true voice of ancient Egypt, its written word, remained locked in silence. That silence was broken almost by chance in 1799 when French soldiers near the delta town of Rosetta uncovered a dark granite slab bearing an inscription in three scripts: Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic. This stone, soon to be called the Rosetta Stone, would become the key to deciphering a language lost for nearly 1400 years. The Rosetta Stone's Greek text quickly revealed that it contained a royal decree honoring Ptolemy V. But its true value lay in providing a direct parallel between Greek, known to scholars, and the two Egyptian scripts. Over the next 2 decades, linguists and antiquarians across Europe wrestled with its secrets. It was Jean-François Champollion, a brilliant French scholar with a gift for languages, who finally cracked the code in 1822. Realizing that hieroglyphs were not mere symbols, but a sophisticated mix of phonetic and ideographic signs, Champollion opened a linguistic doorway into Egypt's past. Walls that once spoke only in mystery now told stories of kings and commoners, of harvests and hymns, of triumphs and tears. With hieroglyphs deciphered, the field of Egyptology was born, ushering in a new era of systematic excavation and study. Scholars like Carl Richard Lepsius, Flinders Petrie, and Howard Carter roamed the deserts with notebooks and trowels, unearthing everything from royal necropolises to humble workmen's villages. Their findings transformed dusty legend into tangible history, filling museum halls with sarcophagi, papyri, and statues that dazzled the modern gaze. Entire lifetimes were spent tracing the lives of pharaohs, mapping burial grounds, and piecing together the daily rhythms of ancient craftsmen, scribes, and farmers. Meanwhile, the mystique of Egypt seeped into art and architecture far beyond the banks of the Nile. Obelisks were erected in Paris, London, New York, and Istanbul. Egyptian motifs adorned jewelry, furniture, and operatic stage sets. The romance of ancient Egypt, renewed by archaeology, became a symbol of both exotic wonder and human ingenuity. Movie screens flickered with tales of mummies and lost tombs, while literature echoed with the laments of kings and the whispers of desert winds. In the 20th century, the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb by Howard Carter in 1922 amplified this fascination to fever pitch. The sight of the boy king's golden mask, radiant and intact, affirmed the enduring power of Egypt's artistry and its promise of eternity. Crowds queued for hours to glimpse traveling exhibitions, and newspapers chronicled each object with breathless excitement. Egypt, it seemed, had gifted the modern world a mirror reflecting its own longing for continuity and transcendence. Today, modern Egyptology continues to evolve, guided by technology unimaginable to early explorers. Satellite imagery reveals hidden pyramids beneath the sands. Ground-penetrating radar maps tombs before a single stone is lifted. 3D scanning preserves temple reliefs in digital form, safeguarding them against erosion and human harm. Multidisciplinary teams, archaeologists, linguists, conservators, geneticists, work in concert, piecing together DNA from mummies, translating forgotten spells, and restoring faded pigments to their former brilliance. At the same time, Egypt's ancient heritage fuels a vibrant industry of tourism. Each year, millions journey to Giza's plateau, stand in the cool shadow of Luxor's pillars, sail the river's languid bends, and watch the sun set behind the colossi of Abu Simbel. Guides recount tales of Ra's daily voyage, of Isis's devotion, of Nefertari's grace. Markets brim with papyrus paintings and alabaster figurines, echoing crafts as old as the dynasties themselves. While tourism brings challenges, erosion, overcrowding, the delicate balance of preservation and access, it also sustains global stewardship for Egypt's treasures, ensuring that their stories remain part of humanity's shared inheritance. Thus, the legacy of the Nile endures, not as a relic trapped in the past, but as a living river of inspiration and knowledge. From Napoleon's artists to Champollion's luminous decipherment, from Carter's candlelit doorway into Tutankhamun's tomb to the digital archaeologists of today, each generation dips its hand into the flowing water and emerges richer, humbled, and more deeply connected to the heartbeat of antiquity. Egypt, cradle of civilization, continues to remind us that time is both fragile and eternal, and that within the stillness of stone can dwell echoes strong enough to cross millennia. The enduring influence of ancient Egypt stretches far beyond its deserts and monuments, extending deep into the architecture, spirituality, and scientific imagination of civilizations across the globe. For thousands of years, the precision and grandeur of Egyptian building techniques have stood as a testament to their mastery of design, measurement, and symbolism. From the monumental geometry of the Great Pyramids to the intricate reliefs of the Temple of Horus at Edfu, Egyptian architecture continues to inspire both awe and imitation. In the neoclassical periods of Europe, particularly during the 18th and 19th centuries, echoes of Egyptian motifs began to appear across public buildings, cemeteries, and even personal homes. Columns crowned with lotus capitals, obelisks rising in city parks, and facades adorned with sun discs and winged scarabs became visual echoes of a civilization long past but never forgotten. The Washington Monument in the United States, the Place de la Concorde obelisk in Paris, and countless Masonic temples drew directly from Egypt's architectural lexicon, testaments to how ancient forms could still project power, order, and timelessness in modern contexts. Beyond architecture, Egypt's influence penetrated deeply into the realm of spirituality and metaphysics. Their beliefs in the soul's journey, the weighing of the heart, and the eternal afterlife shaped early Judeo-Christian ideas and filtered through into later esoteric traditions. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, with its detailed instructions for navigating the afterlife, became a source of fascination not just for scholars, but for mystics and spiritual seekers around the world. Hermeticism, a philosophical system attributed to the legendary Hermes Trismegistus, claimed lineage from Egyptian priests and preserved concepts such as divine unity, the transformation of the soul, and cosmic harmony, concepts that found echoes in both Renaissance thought and modern New Age beliefs. The impact of Egyptian science and intellectual achievement also remains profound. Long before the rise of Greek philosophy, the Egyptians had already made impressive strides in mathematics, medicine, and astronomy. Their engineers used principles of geometry to align pyramids with celestial bodies with breathtaking accuracy. Their physicians performed surgeries, recorded symptoms, and developed pharmacological remedies using an empirical understanding of the human body. Their calendars, based on solar and lunar cycles, influenced later systems adopted by the Romans and beyond. The methods and instruments developed by ancient Egyptian scientists laid the groundwork for more modern fields. Their use of nilometers to measure flood levels, for example, prefigured hydrological engineering, while their architectural alignment with solstices and cardinal directions demonstrated a deep understanding of astronomy long before the telescope. Even the simple act of documenting knowledge on papyrus scrolls using ink and styluses marked the beginning of written scientific record-keeping. Yet perhaps what endures most profoundly is not just the content of Egyptian thought, but its sense of order, ma'at, which governed every aspect of life. This principle of balance, truth, and cosmic harmony underpinned their legal codes, their religious observances, and even their art. It was a guiding force for pharaohs and peasants alike, a unifying thread that wove together their vision of the universe. In this, Egypt was not merely a society obsessed with death and burial, as popular myths might suggest, but a vibrant culture rooted in a spiritual and intellectual framework that continues to inspire. Modern creatives still turn to ancient Egypt for aesthetic and thematic resonance. Filmmakers portray its mystique through epic tales and mythological reimaginings. Writers draw from its pantheon and cosmology to build fantasy worlds or explore timeless human questions. Fashion designers borrow its visual motifs, while musicians and visual artists evoke its grandeur and mystery in works both serious and playful. What fascinates so many is not only Egypt's age or scale, but the enigmatic clarity with which it viewed life, death, and the eternal. Every artifact, from a scarab amulet to a colossal obelisk, carried meaning. Every tomb, whether belonging to a royal or a scribe, reflected care and cosmological precision. The Egyptians believed that the material world was inextricably linked with the divine, and that life's ultimate goal was to align oneself with the eternal rhythms of the universe. That belief system, layered, rigorous, and beautiful, has not vanished, but continues to resonate with all who seek deeper meaning in the structures of time. In the end, ancient Egypt is not merely a land of mummies and monuments. It is not just a collection of ruins, dry textbooks, or faded frescoes. It is a civilization of light, of intellectual brilliance, spiritual insight, and architectural majesty. A civilization that offered humanity one of its first visions of ordered society, cosmic connection, and human potential. As the Nile flows endlessly from the highlands to the sea, so too does Egypt's legacy course through the channels of modern thought, creativity, and identity. It is a civilization not buried in tombs, but ever unfolding in the minds and dreams of those who gaze upon its wonders and listen.